Meadowpillars is a hybrid generative 16-step Hocketing sequencer for the Teletype in conjunction with the Monome grid. It can play a constructed sequence as arranged, like a traditional sequencer, or generate any number of notes to fit into a selected scale set using the n.b operator. It's billed as a 16-step sequencer, but with some clever switches and timing, you can treat it as a 32-step or even 64-step sequencer. It is also designed to hocket the sequences or pass them around the different outputs of the teletype and allows the user to reverse playback of sequences. This, combined with the ability to change the loop length and start end positions of each sequence, gives Meadowpillars a lot of live playing appeal. To show off a little bit of what Meadowpillars is capable of, I recorded a bunch of demo tracks that I posted to my channel that I'll give you some short snippets of right now, but there will also be some links in the description for you to find the original full tracks if you want to check those out as well. When you load the scene, the grid will light up to show the two sections of the layout. The top 4 rows should be unlit besides the playheads of each sequence, while the bottom 4 rows contain some buttons for controlling the scene. Trigger inputs 1 through 4 of the teletype are for clocking sequences 1 through 4 respectively, and trigger input 5 resets all the sequences to their start points. Of course, you'll need to set up your sequences first, so let's go over what the grid looks like and how to set up sequences. The top 4 rows of buttons are where we display the state of our 4 sequences, or our Meadow. The bottom 4 rows are where our controls live. There should be 5 distinct columns of lit buttons, or our pillars, which we'll go into detail about in a later section. First, let's go over the sequence display and dig deeper into how sequences are stored in the pattern data. So each row of the sequence display, or Meadow, represents one of our 16-step sequences. A sequence can be considered a list of 16 beats that denote rests, normal notes, or generative notes, as well as a list of 16 pitches that denote what degree of a user-selected scale will play. Each row displays a bright playhead to denote where in the sequence we currently are stepwise. If you look in the Teletype's pattern data, you'll see that all 4 patterns are by default set to be of length 16. Going from index 0 to index 15. This is where our beats live, represented by the values 0, denoting a rest, 1, denoting a normal note, and 2, denoting a generative note. A rest will produce no trigger output for that step. A normal note will produce a trigger and set the corresponding CV out to the user-defined pitch at that step. And a generative note will produce a trigger and set the corresponding CV out to a random note within a certain range of the first degrees of the user-defined scale. That range is determined by the param knob, and we'll go over that in a later section. You can go into the pattern data and set these steps to 0, 1, or 2, but that's a bit tedious. Rather, the Meadow is actually a set of buttons that allow you to modify these beats on the fly. Hit a button and you'll see it light up. Hit it again and it'll get brighter. And hit it again and it'll go back to being off. So off means rest, dim means normal note, bright means generative note. And you'll see these changes reflected in the pattern data as you're playing around with the Meadow buttons as well. Using the Meadow like this, you can sequence the beats on the grid from left to right, step 1 to step 16. There is also a way to generate beats on the fly using one of the controls, which we'll talk about in a later section. Alright, so I've set up a simple sequence without any generative notes for our first sequence, and I've patched that into our first Platts voice. So let's run that and see what it sounds like. Notice that so far all we've done is sequence the beats, so even if we start running the sequence, the pitch information never changes. That's because we need to add our pitch information to the pattern data. For each sequence, the beats are contained within indices 0 to 15, and our pitch information will live between indices 16 to 31, so 16 steps after the beats. And each of these indices is connected to the respective beat 16 indices before it. So index 0 is pitch index 16, index 1 is pitch index 17, etc. So we can go in here and start adding just any positive integer. Keep in mind these are going to be used as the scale degrees for the n.b operator. So let's just put, let's go 3 here. Let's go 8 here, maybe 4 here, and then 6 here. And we'll leave the other 4 beats as they are. You can already hear that we're starting to get some different pitches. So unfortunately you can't use the grid to add pitch information by hand, but there is a button to generate random pitch sequences, just like there is one to generate random beat sequences. We'll go over those 2 controls a bit later. Also keep in mind that even if you set a pitch for, say, the second index, or index 1 of our sequence, say I'll make that 7 here, that pitch will never play because that particular beat is a rest. And the same will be true if the beat is a generative note, like here. Even though I've set it to be 7, because it's a generative note, it's going to play a randomly generated pitch each time. So it's not guaranteed to use the pitch that I've selected. Speaking of generative notes, I've set up a simple generative sequence here on sequence 2. And notice that I haven't put any pitches into the pattern data for this sequence. This is all being generated on the fly. And the range of notes that's being played here is anywhere between the 0th and 12th scale degree of the scale that we've selected. And the param knob is what's determining that range right now. So the param knob is scaled from 0 to 24. So all the way to the left, it's going to be 0. And so you can notice all my generative notes are now playing 0. But as I slowly start to increase that, the range of notes that are possible to generate increases. Until eventually you get back to that middle initial position, 0 to 12. And then you can go even higher beyond that, all the way up to 24. And this range set by the param knob's position is also used when randomly generating pitches on the fly, which we will show off with the controls, which are next. Alright, so let's go over the sequence controls. So each column of buttons, or pillar, does something to control the scene. We have controls to, from left to right, start, stop sequence playback, generate random beat sequences, Hocket sequences up and down, generate random pitch sequences, and reverse sequence playback. So let's go over how they work a couple at a time. So we have two specific playback controls. We have ones for starting and stopping sequences and for reversing sequence playback. Let's start with starting and stopping. So if the button is active or bright, like these all are, then the sequence will be clocked normally from its trigger input. We can see that right now if I start the clock, which is patched into input 3, you can see that the sequence 3 playhead is moving normally. But if I were to take the third input and hit it again, it becomes dim, and now even though the teletype is still receiving clock, the sequence is not advancing. This effectively mutes the sequence. And these all work in the order they appear up here. So the first one is matched to the first one, the second one is matched to the second one, third, fourth, and fourth. And the same is true of the reversed sequence playback controls. For the reversing playback controls, if the button is dim, as they all currently are, then the sequence will advance forward as normal, which we can see with sequence 3. But as soon as I toggle it on and make it bright, now the sequence is moving backwards. And you can have this for as many different sequences at a time as you would like. This toggle is very fun to play live because it can lead to some very strange rhythmic patterns or just interesting melody reversals and counterpoints if you like. So after our playback controls, the next main controls are the generative controls, which are these two columns of 2 wide buttons. These are just 4 buttons, they just happen to be 2 wide because I wanted things to be a bit symmetrical. So this set of buttons on the left is for generating beats on the fly, and this set of buttons on the right is for generating pitch sequences on the fly. So let's start with the beats. For sequence 3, you see I have nothing set in there right now, and if I hit the third one down here, now you can see that we are generating beat sequences. So it will randomly generate 0s, 1s, and 2s to fit into the pattern data. And when you find one that you like, let's go with this one. Now I'm going to start the clock, and we're going to hear what that sounds like. Now notice that the generative notes are generating normally, but the regular notes still don't have any pitch data, and we can confirm this if we go into the pattern data in the teletype, and we look down here where the pitch data would normally exist for sequence 3, and it's all 0s. So let's use our generative pitch controls on this side, pattern 3, and you can see in the pattern data, you can see it being generated. And what we can do is, I'm actually going to patch this back into number 1. And let's start patching these guys back into these inputs. There we go. So let's start generating a bunch of pitch sequences, and I'm also going to generate the 4th sequence here. Okay, so now we can see all 4 sequences kind of working in concert here. Let's go ahead and reverse a couple of these. And then I'm just going to hit the reset, which is going to go into input 5, just so things are a bit more in sync with each other, if you could even call it that. Alright, so I've set up some sequences here, which I'm going to run now. And we're going to show off kind of the main conceit behind this whole scene, which is the Hocketing controls. So the middle controls here is really just 2 buttons. They're 2x2 buttons, one to go up and one to go down. And this will shift the sequences between all the different voices. And these indicators here, which are the bright lights to either side of it, help you keep track of what your current Hocketing offset is. The offset starts at 0, which is why everything's at the bottom. And as you hit this button up here, it will increase the offset by 1. And if you look at the patterns as they exist in the Meadow, you can see them shifting around. And so you can keep your eye on this brighter generative node here. You'll notice this sequence will move up to output 1 now. And so it allows you to move the sequences between different voices. And when you hit the top and you go to an offset of 4, it wraps back around to 0, to where you were before. Alright, so let's talk about some of the things that you can't do with the grid, but are still possible if you handle them manually. So we already talked about how you can't use the grid to sequence the pitches. You can use the grid to sequence the beats, but in order to sequence the pitches, you either have to use the grid to generate them, but if you want to do it manually, you have to go into the pattern data and type it into the pattern data itself. There are some other things that the grid currently can't handle, but you are certainly able to do either in live mode or just by messing with the pattern data. So let's take a look at some of those. First up is resizing sequences. Currently, all the sequences are set to a length of 16, but you are more than welcome to go into the pattern data and use some shortcuts to change the pattern lengths. So I'm going to say the start point for sequence 1 is actually index 3 here, and it's going to loop all the way to index 8. I'm using Shift S and Shift E to set the start and end points. So now, even though you can't see the start and end points on the grid, you'll notice the playhead is only staying within this specific range that we are looping. And you can do that for any number of sequences. Let's say I want to start this one here, and I want to go all the way down to 14. Just keep in mind that if you reset a loop's start and end point in such a way where the playhead is now outside of that new range, the playhead will have to advance all the way to the end of the old range, looping back around to the beginning of the old range until it re-enters this new range. Then it will start looping using the current start and end points. If you want to avoid this, you could use some clever resetting with the trigger input 5, although that may be a little tricky given what kind of performance you're doing. Another thing that you might want to do is change your scale using the n.b operator. Normally this is something you do while setting up the sequences, but you can also just do it during a performance using live mode. So let's try that. Let's say I want to go from whatever scale I'm using right now to n.b. Let's use a root of 5. And for the scale, let's say, let's go with like -5. I feel like that one didn't really have as radical of a change as I thought we would. What if we now go to root 2 -3? See, there we go. So doing this in the middle of performance may lead to some very interesting results, we'll say. But it's fun to play around with and see what kinds of different scales you can come up with. You can also feel free to use whatever modifications to the teletype out you want to do. So you can add some slew, you can add some offset if things are a little low for you. So let's go over some of those right now. Let's say that I want to add a loop from 1 to 4 here. And I'm going to say cv.slew, let's say I. Let's add maybe 500 milliseconds of slew to all the CV outs. That's a little extreme. Maybe we'll have it back down like 200. Yeah, that's a bit better. You can also add CV offsets. So if I want to say cv.off, maybe cv2, set it to 1 volt. So cv2 is now 1 octave higher than the rest of the CV outs. Using this in conjunction with the generative range of the param knob is also kind of fun. So you can feel free to play around with a bunch of different aspects of the Teletype, and it allows Meadowpillars to be a very interactive, playable surface of a sequencer during a performance. So that's pretty much all you need to get started with this fun little sequencer. It's quite open-ended, so I hope you have some fun making some interesting noise with this thing. Enjoy!